the United States Supreme Court in 1859 held that black people were not persons within the meaning of American law, and therefore were not entitled to fundamental human rights. Well, since that time, that law has been overturned. In the early 20th century, women were still considered in Canada not to be persons for certain legal purposes. The whole history of our law for the last 400 years has been toward the more accurate understanding of human rights and who is a human being, and the expansion of human rights. And so it seems to me that it's an anomaly in Canada in the 21st century for anyone to tolerate a law which designates as non-human someone who really is a human being. So I thought when I raised the issue of Section 223 that the real issue would be about deciding when does a child become a human being. You know, it is possible to disagree about that. Those survey results that I mentioned to you earlier demonstrate that there is a variety of opinion about that, at least about when a child's interest should be protected. Some believe from the moment of conception, others 2 months after, 3 months, 6 months. So I thought, well, you know, it's legitimate. We can talk about how we discern who is a human being deserving of human rights protection. I was sadly surprised to discover that, in fact, for some people it doesn't matter whether a child is a human being or not. That for some people it's acceptable to enact a law which designates a person as a non-person or non-human being in order to achieve a particular result. If someone were to say to me, fine, all right, I acknowledge that a child is a human being before birth, but I still think that we should be allowed to take the child's life, at least we're talking the same language, and I can say, well, explain to me, why do you think that? And we can weigh the issues. But you can't do that if you pretend that a child is not a human being before the moment of complete birth. But the question of condoning or tolerating a law which designates any human being as a non-human is even more important than the abortion issue. It has wider implications. Who's next? What about someone who's lying in a coma? They may not be in a vegetative state, they're just unconscious and can't communicate. Are they to be a human being? Or what about children who are born with various disabilities? And by the way, that includes everybody in this room. But suppose somebody gets the idea that children with a certain kind of disability ought to be designated as not human beings because we want to achieve a result of being able to take their lives. The result that you're trying to achieve does not justify a law that says any human being is a non-human. And I don't care how it relates to abortion. It's a wider and much more important issue if Parliament is to condone or tolerate such a law. At the time that this law was being formulated by judges, Shakespeare was writing The Merchant of Venice. Many of you here remember Shylock's soliloquy? This was Shakespeare's attempt to say that laws which treated Jewish folk as less than human were wrong, because Jewish folk were human beings too. If you prick me, do I not bleed? This is not a new issue. The point of what I'm doing is to try to discern the first principles that are important to all Canadians. And I never dreamed that there would be much contention about the principle that every human being should be recognized as a human being, but that seems to be where the debate lies at the moment. I believe that every law has to have an honest, objective basis. We cannot, like Humpty Dumpty, simply say words mean what I want them to mean. You cannot discover whether someone is inherently a human being based on your own philosophy. You have to study the individual. Now, it's true that you will weigh the evidence, but to completely disregard the biological evidence about who is a human being seems to me to be dishonest and arbitrary and not legitimate. And no law which is dishonest and arbitrary is legitimate. That's why I tell people I'm not really talking about abortion, because there are a lot of other questions wrapped up in the abortion issue. You know, it's quite possible to say that when the rights of two people, two human beings conflict, one person's rights have to overcome the other's. It's possible to say that. We don't let parents smoke in vehicles that are transporting children anymore. The parents' rights are subordinate to the child. And it would be possible to argue that a woman's right to be free of pregnancy and the trauma of childbirth should somehow overcome the child's right to live. I'm not saying I agree with that, I'm just saying it would be an area for discussion. And in fact, when I said at the outset that we have to be sensitive, what I mean is that we have to try to understand that point of view. A good pro-life friend of mine pointed out a study that was done about 20 years ago that says that for some women, becoming pregnant is like a part of themselves dying. You know, it has serious implications for women. We can't deny that, and we can't ignore it, and we shouldn't be insensitive to that when we discuss these issues. But having said that, I'm nowhere near discussing any of that. I'm way back at laws need to be just and honest to be legitimate. This is what she said. Her reasons, that is the mother, for having an abortion would, however, be the proper subject of inquiry at the later stages of her pregnancy when the state's compelling interest in the protection of the fetus would justify it in prescribing conditions. The precise point in which the development of the fetus the precise point in the development of the fetus at which the state's interest in its protection becomes compelling, I leave to the informed judgment of the legislature, which is in a position to receive guidance on the subject from all the relevant disciplines. In other words, this pro-abortion woman was recommending precisely what I'm now proposing. Here's the kicker, her final word on that. It seems to me, she said, however, that it might fall somewhere in the second trimester. Even the judge who threw out the abortion law would have been willing to consider that children deserve the protection of the law at least in the second trimester of their lives. So if anyone says to you, oh well, this is Mr. Woodworth being pro-life, it is, but you can tell them that Justice Wilson agreed with Mr. Woodworth. And if anyone says to you, well, this is just a man's point of view, you can tell them that Justice Wilson agreed with it too. Now, I'm hoping that I can persuade most Canadians of that at least, that laws which are arbitrary and dishonest are not legitimate. And if I can persuade them of that principle, I hope it won't be too difficult to persuade Canadians of the next principle, which is that a law that arbitrarily and without regard to the evidence declares someone to be non-human is also dishonest and not legitimate. The child, in fact, inherently is a human being at least 5 minutes before the moment of complete birth. Having watched my own children being born, I'm pretty convinced of that. Nothing happens, there is no magical moment when birth occurs that transforms that child in any fundamental way. The child's lungs are cleared and the child begins to breathe, but there are people who can't breathe on their own, and we still know they're human beings. And in the same way, a child is a human being at least 5 minutes before birth. And after that, we need to inform ourselves from the relevant disciplines about what it is that describes a human being. And then the next question after that is, in fact, can we convince Canadians about when a child really does become a human being? And I'm nowhere near that yet. And that's why, for me, this is not simply a discussion about abortion. And I don't want it to be, because there's too many other issues that will distract from the fundamental first principles. I believe if we can establish that laws need to be just and honest, if we can establish that a child is a human being before the moment of complete birth, then we can move on to the issues that follow. So what I would like from you is to faithfully ponder what I've said and think about it and understand it and try to reflect it in your conversations. I will be very soon proposing a motion in Parliament. It will only be a motion, and it will only be to study the issue and report back on options to deal with Section 223. I am not even trying to impose my desired result on this. I'm only asking for an open-minded consideration. Thank you very much for your patience, and also, by the way, when the time does arrive, when my motion is presented, I hope that you will encourage your friends across Canada to write to their members of Parliament in order to encourage them to support the motion. Thank you very much.